The moment your own key stops working is the moment you discover whether a house is truly your home. My name is Rebecca Carter, and that realization came to me on a cold Thursday afternoon, standing on the front porch of the house where I had lived for nearly 18 years. I had just returned from a 4-day trip to Chicago to help my older sister recover from a minor medical procedure. The flight home was delayed. My suitcase felt heavier than usual, and all I wanted was a hot shower and a quiet evening in my own living room. I parked in the driveway, carried my bag to the front door, and slipped my key into the lock. It would not turn. At first, I assumed I was tired. I tried again. Nothing. I pulled the key out, checked it, and tried a third time. The lock did not move. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. I walked around to the garage entrance and tested that key as well. It did not work either. By then, confusion was turning into concern. I stood on the porch looking at the familiar front door, trying to understand what was happening. This was my house, my address. My mortgage payment helped cover this place every month. Yet suddenly I was standing outside like a stranger. I reached for my phone and called Daniel. My husband answered on the third ring. "Hey," he said casually. "Did you get home okay?" I stared at the front door. Why do my keys not work? Silence. Just a few seconds, but long enough to make my heart sink. "Rebecca," he finally said, "I was going to talk to you about that." Those words instantly made everything worse. "Talk to me about what?" I asked. Another pause. Then he said something I never expected to hear. "Mom thought it would be best if the locks were changed." For a moment, I honestly believed I had misunderstood him. "Your mother changed the locks on our house?" My voice remained calm, but only because I was too shocked to sound angry. "She was worried about security," Daniel replied weakly. "Security?" I repeated. "While I was out of town, I looked through the glass panel beside the door and saw movement inside the house. Seconds later, the front door opened. Standing there was Margaret Carter, my mother-in-law. She looked completely comfortable, as though she belonged there more than I did. "There you are," she said with a polite smile. "I was wondering when you would get back." I stood frozen on the porch holding my suitcase. Margaret stepped aside but made no effort to explain herself. No apology. No embarrassment. Nothing. I looked past her into the house and realized something had changed. Not the furniture. Not the walls. Something deeper. For the first time since marrying Daniel, I felt like a visitor in my own life. And as I crossed the threshold carrying my luggage, I had the unsettling feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. Margaret closed the door behind me and walked back into the kitchen as though nothing unusual had happened. I remained standing in the entryway holding my suitcase, trying to process the fact that I had just been locked out of my own house. The familiar surroundings suddenly felt unfamiliar. The framed family photographs on the walls. The furniture I had helped choose. The dining table where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays. Everything looked the same, yet somehow none of it felt like it belonged to me anymore. A few minutes later, Daniel arrived home from work. The moment he stepped through the garage door and saw me standing there, he knew exactly why I was upset. What surprised me was how unsurprised he looked. He set his briefcase down and avoided eye contact. That hurt more than anything Margaret had done. "You knew," I said quietly. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Rebecca, please let me explain." I stared at him. "How long?" He hesitated. "About a week." For several seconds, I could not speak. A week. He had known for an entire week that the locks on our home had been changed while I was away. A week of phone calls and text messages during my trip. A week of normal conversations. A week of pretending everything was fine. "And you did not think to tell me?" I asked. Daniel looked uncomfortable. "Mom thought it was necessary." I laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "That is not what I asked." Margaret appeared in the doorway connecting the kitchen and living room. Her expression remained calm. "I told Daniel it was for the best," she said. "For the best." I repeated. "How exactly is locking me out of my own house for the best?" Margaret folded her arms. "This house has become a source of tension. I thought some changes were needed." The statement made no sense. I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to challenge her explanation, waiting for him to remind her that this was our home, not hers, waiting for him to say something. Instead, he remained silent. The room suddenly felt very small. I realized I was no longer arguing about a lock. The lock was simply evidence of something much larger. It represented years of decisions being made without me, years of boundaries being ignored, Years of Daniel allowing his mother to occupy a place in our marriage that should never have belonged to her. Later that evening, after Margaret finally left, I sat alone in the living room while Daniel moved around the kitchen pretending everything could still be normal. My suitcase remained unopened near the stairs. I stared at it for a long time. The strange thing was that I did not feel angry anymore. I felt tired. Deeply tired. Tired of explaining why respect mattered. Tired of defending my place in a family I had spent 18 years supporting. Tired of hoping someone would choose me without being asked. As darkness settled outside the windows, a realization quietly formed in my mind. The changed lock was not the beginning of this story. It was simply the first time the truth had become impossible to ignore. The following morning, I woke up earlier than usual. For several minutes, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while the events of the previous day replayed in my mind. The changed locks. Margaret standing inside the house. Daniel admitting he had known for a week. None of it felt real. Yet the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the situation had not appeared out of nowhere. It was the result of years of smaller moments that I had ignored, excused, or endured. As I made coffee that morning, memories surfaced one after another. I remembered the first house Daniel and I purchased together nearly 18 years earlier. We had spent weeks discussing paint colors, furniture, and renovation plans. Then Margaret arrived with her own list of suggestions. Somehow her suggestions became decisions. The guest room became the room she wanted. The dining room became the style she preferred. Even then, I noticed the pattern, but I convinced myself it was harmless. After all, she was family. A few years later, when Daniel and I planned our 10th anniversary trip, Margaret objected because the dates overlapped with a community event she wanted Daniel to attend. Instead of telling her no, Daniel spent 2 days trying to negotiate a compromise. I remember sitting at the kitchen table wondering why a married couple needed permission to celebrate their own anniversary. Then there was the time I accepted a promotion at work. I was proud of the accomplishment. It came with more responsibility and a meaningful salary increase. During a family dinner, Margaret announced that she hoped my new position would not distract me from my responsibilities at home. Several relatives laughed politely. Daniel smiled awkwardly and changed the subject. Once again, nobody addressed the real issue. Looking back, I could see the same pattern repeated over and over. Margaret crossed a boundary. Daniel avoided conflict. I adjusted. Every compromise seemed small at the time. Together, they formed something much larger. That evening, Daniel came home carrying takeout from my favorite restaurant. Under different circumstances, the gesture might have touched me. Instead, it felt like an attempt to smooth over something that could not be fixed with a meal. We sat across from each other at the dining room table. Neither of us spoke much. Eventually, Daniel looked up and said, "I know things have been difficult." I almost laughed. Difficult. The words sounded absurdly small compared to what had happened. "Do you?" I asked quietly. Daniel frowned. "I am trying." I studied his face for a moment. He genuinely believed he was trying. That was what made the situation so heartbreaking. Daniel was not cruel. He was not malicious. He simply spent years choosing comfort over courage. Years choosing silence over protection. Years hoping problems would disappear if nobody talked about them. Later that night, I sat alone on the back patio watching the sun disappear behind neighboring houses. For the first time, I stopped focusing on Margaret entirely. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. This was never just about a controlling mother-in-law. It was about a marriage where one person had been asked to carry all the emotional weight. And for the first time in 18 years, I found myself wondering what life would look like if I finally put that weight down. Over the next few days, something inside me shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else could see. The change was quiet, almost invisible, yet it affected everything. I stopped trying to convince myself that what happened was normal. I stopped searching for explanations that would somehow make it acceptable. Most importantly, I stopped pretending that being tolerated was the same thing as being valued. Daniel seemed to sense the distance growing between us. He became unusually attentive. He asked whether I wanted coffee in the morning. He offered to pick up groceries after work. He even suggested a weekend getaway, something he had not mentioned in years. On the surface, it looked like effort. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized he was reacting to my withdrawal rather than addressing the reason behind it. One evening, we sat together in the living room while the television played quietly in the background. Neither of us was paying attention to it. Finally, I muted the sound and looked directly at him. I need to ask you something. Daniel nodded. Okay. I took a slow breath. If I had changed the locks while your mother was out of town, what would have happened? The question immediately caught him off guard. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. That is different. I almost smiled. Why? He opened his mouth but struggled to answer. Because. His voice trailed off. Because what? I asked. Several seconds passed. Then he sighed. Mom would have been upset. The answer hung in the room between us. Not because it was surprising, because it was honest. For years, Daniel's decisions had been guided by one goal above all others: avoiding his mother's disapproval. Even now, that was the first consequence he imagined. Not my feelings. Not our marriage. His mother's reaction. Do you hear yourself? I asked quietly. Daniel looked down at his hands. For the first time, he seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the reality of what he was saying. I never meant for things to get this far, he said. I believed him. That was the tragedy. Daniel never intended to hurt me. He simply allowed hurt to happen whenever confronting it felt inconvenient. Later that week, Margaret stopped by unexpectedly. I was working from home when her car pulled into the driveway. She entered carrying a container of homemade soup, as though she were performing a thoughtful gesture. We exchanged polite greetings. Then she sat at the kitchen table and began discussing neighborhood news, upcoming holidays, and family events. Not once did she mention the locks. Not once did she acknowledge what she had done. Eventually, I interrupted her. Do you believe you had the right to make that decision? Margaret blinked. The question clearly surprised her. I was trying to help, she replied. There it was. The explanation she always used. Helping. Protecting. Looking out for the family. Words that sounded generous until examined closely. I looked at her across the table and realized something that changed everything. Margaret genuinely believed she belonged at the center of decisions that were never hers to make. And Daniel had spent years reinforcing that belief. As she continued talking, I found myself no longer focused on proving her wrong. Instead, I began asking a different question. If neither of them intended to change, how much longer was I willing to live this way? That question stayed with me for days. If neither Daniel nor Margaret intended to change, how much longer was I willing to remain in a situation that constantly asked me to accept less than I deserved? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had spent years trying to earn a place that should have already been mine. I had organized family holidays, remembered birthdays, supported relatives through illnesses, and helped create a home where everyone felt welcome. Yet somehow I was still treated like an outsider whenever Margaret decided my opinion conflicted with hers. The following weekend, Daniel left early to help his mother with a community fundraiser. Watching him pull out of the driveway, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. Instead of feeling abandoned, I felt clear-headed. I spent the morning cleaning a closet in the guest room and sorting through old boxes. Inside one of them, I found photographs from the early years of our marriage. There was a picture of Daniel and me standing in front of our first apartment, smiling as though the future belonged entirely to us. Another showed us painting the living room in our first house. Looking at those images, I remembered how hopeful I had been. Back then, I believed marriage meant building a life together. Somewhere along the way, that partnership had slowly been replaced by accommodation. I had accommodated Margaret's opinions, accommodated Daniel's avoidance, accommodated situations that left me feeling unseen. By late afternoon, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook in front of me. At first, I was not sure why I had opened it. Then I started writing. I made 2 lists. The first contained things I could control. The second contained things I could not. The second list filled quickly. Margaret's behavior, Daniel's choices, other people's opinions, their expectations, their reactions. Then I looked at the first list. My boundaries, my decisions, my future, my self-respect. The contrast was impossible to ignore. That evening, Daniel returned home and immediately began talking about his day. I listened politely, but something had changed. For the first time, I was hearing his words without automatically prioritizing his perspective above my own. When he finished speaking, he smiled and asked, "Everything okay?" I looked at him for a moment. He genuinely expected the answer to be yes. Not because he was dishonest, because he had become accustomed to me carrying discomfort quietly. "I have been doing a lot of thinking," I replied. His expression shifted slightly. "About what?" I folded my hands together on the table. "About what I want my life to look like 5 years from now." Daniel laughed softly. That sounds serious. It is. The room fell silent. He waited for me to continue, but I did not. Not yet. Some truths require preparation before they are spoken aloud. Later that night, while Daniel slept upstairs, I sat alone in the living room and searched online for apartment listings in nearby neighborhoods. I told myself I was only exploring possibilities, gathering information, nothing more. Yet as photographs of small apartments appeared on the screen, I felt something unexpected. Hope. Not because I wanted to leave. Because for the first time in years, I was allowing myself to imagine a future that did not depend on other people finally deciding to value me. Over the next 2 weeks, I quietly continued exploring possibilities. What began as curiosity slowly became a plan. I visited several apartment complexes after work, telling nobody where I was going. Some were too expensive. Others felt temporary and impersonal. Then one Wednesday evening, I toured a small apartment on the edge of town overlooking a tree-lined walking trail. The building was not luxurious. The kitchen was modest. The living room was smaller than the one I had now. Yet the moment I stepped inside, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Peace. On the drive home, I could not stop thinking about it. That apartment represented more than a place to live. It represented choice. The following weekend, Daniel and I attended a family gathering at Margaret's house. The experience only strengthened my growing certainty. Throughout the afternoon, Margaret directed conversations, assigned responsibilities, and offered opinions on everything from vacations to finances. Several times she spoke about decisions involving Daniel and me as though she were part of the marriage herself. What struck me most was not her behavior. It was Daniel's response. Or rather, the lack of one. He nodded, agreed, smiled politely. The same pattern repeated itself yet again. At one point, Margaret mentioned that she was considering spending more time at our house because she liked having a key and access whenever she wanted. The statement hung in the air. Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. I looked at Daniel. Surely this time he would say something. Instead, he reached for his glass and changed the subject. In that moment, something settled inside me completely. Not anger. Acceptance. I finally understood that I had been waiting for a version of Daniel that did not exist. The man sitting across from me was kind in many ways, but he was never going to choose temporary discomfort in order to protect a boundary. He had spent nearly 5 decades avoiding conflict, and I could not build my future around the hope that he might suddenly become someone else. The next Monday, I signed a lease. My hands remained surprisingly steady as I completed the paperwork. When the property manager handed me the keys, I stared at them for several seconds. Such a simple object. Yet they felt entirely different from the keys that had failed to open my own front door weeks earlier. These keys represented ownership of my choices, control over my space, freedom from constantly defending my right to belong. That evening, I sat alone in the driveway after returning home. The house looked exactly as it always had. The porch light glowed softly. The flower beds I planted years ago remained carefully maintained. Anyone passing by would have seen a normal suburban home. They would never have guessed that the woman sitting in the car had already made one of the most important decisions of her life. When I finally walked inside, Daniel greeted me from the living room and asked how my day had been. I looked at him and felt an unexpected sadness. Not because I doubted my decision, because I knew he still had no idea what was coming. And for the first time, I realized I was no longer afraid of leaving. I was afraid of staying. The morning I left felt strangely ordinary. There was no dramatic argument, no final confrontation, no raised voices echoing through the house. In fact, that was what made the moment so powerful. After years of conflict, the end arrived quietly. During the weeks after signing the lease, I had gradually moved a few personal belongings into the apartment. Important documents, family photographs, clothes I rarely wore, small things that went unnoticed. Daniel remained completely unaware. He continued moving through our daily routines as though nothing had changed. One Friday morning, he left for work shortly after 7. Before walking out the door, he kissed my cheek and reminded me that his mother planned to stop by over the weekend. The comment almost made me smile. Even now, Margaret's presence was treated like a certainty while my own feelings remained optional. Once the garage door closed behind him, I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the silence. Sunlight streamed through the windows and illuminated the countertops I had cleaned thousands of times over the years. The house looked peaceful, Yet for the first time, I saw it clearly. This was not a home where I felt secure. It was a place where I had spent years negotiating for respect. Around mid-morning, I began loading the remaining boxes into my car. The process felt calm and deliberate. There was no hesitation. Every decision had already been made long before that day arrived. By noon, the guest room closet was empty. My personal keepsakes were packed away. The photographs that mattered most to me were safely stored in the apartment waiting across town. As I walked through the house one final time, memories surfaced from every room. Holiday dinners, movie nights, birthday celebrations, ordinary evenings that once felt permanent. For a moment, sadness washed over me. Not because I believed I was making a mistake, because I realized how much effort I had invested trying to preserve something that only one person was protecting. I sat at the dining room table and wrote a letter, not to accuse, not to punish, simply to tell the truth. I explained that I was safe. I explained that I needed distance. Most importantly, I explained that leaving was not caused by one lock or one decision. It was the result of years of being treated as though my place in the family depended on someone else's approval. When I finished writing, I folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen counter. Then I picked up my keys. The irony was impossible to miss. Weeks earlier, I had stood outside this house unable to unlock the front door. Now I was walking away from it by choice. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror one final time. The house slowly disappeared behind me. Instead of fear, I felt relief. Hours later, Daniel returned home expecting an ordinary Friday evening. Instead, he found empty spaces where pieces of my life had once been. He found the letter waiting on the counter. And for the first time since the locks had been changed, he was forced to face a reality he could no longer avoid. I was gone, and the silence he had chosen for so many years was finally speaking louder than words. The first week after I left was surprisingly quiet. I expected constant phone calls, emotional messages, or demands for explanations. Instead, there was mostly silence. Daniel called several times during the first evening, but I did not answer. Not because I wanted revenge. I simply needed space to hear my own thoughts without immediately managing someone else's emotions. My new apartment was modest, but every evening I returned to it feeling lighter. The rooms were smaller than the house I left behind, yet they felt entirely mine. Nobody entered without permission. Nobody made decisions on my behalf. Nobody questioned whether I belonged there. Meanwhile, life back at the house was beginning to change in ways Daniel had never anticipated. A few days after I left, he stopped by my office hoping to speak with me. I declined the meeting through a receptionist. Later that afternoon, he left a voicemail. His voice sounded tired. "Rebecca, I think we need to talk. Please call me." I listened once and placed the phone back on the table. For years, every difficult conversation had happened only after a problem became impossible to ignore. This time, I was no longer interested in emergency repairs. I wanted genuine understanding. Several days later, something unexpected happened. One of Daniel's cousins contacted me. We had always been friendly, though not especially close. During our conversation, she admitted that many family members were shocked by what Margaret had done. "People are talking about it," she said carefully. Most of them thought Daniel would stop her. The comment stayed with me long after the call ended. For years, I had assumed many relatives saw Margaret's behavior as normal. Apparently, that was not true. They noticed more than I realized. They simply remained silent. Around the same time, Daniel finally confronted his mother. I only learned the details later, but according to several relatives, the conversation did not go as Margaret expected. At first, she defended herself. She insisted she was protecting the family, protecting the property, protecting her son. Then Daniel asked a question that changed the entire discussion. "Who were you protecting it from?" Margaret reportedly had no answer. Because the truth was painfully obvious. There had never been any threat. No emergency. No crisis. Only control. For the first time, Daniel was looking directly at the situation instead of looking away. A week later, I received another voicemail. This one sounded different. Less defensive, more reflective. Daniel admitted he had spent several evenings reading the letter I left behind. He said he finally understood that the lock itself was not the real issue. It was simply the moment years of ignored boundaries became impossible to deny. Listening to the message, I felt neither satisfaction nor anger. Only sadness. Understanding had finally arrived, but it came after the damage was already done. One Saturday morning, I walked along the trail outside my apartment while autumn leaves drifted across the path. The air felt cool and clean. For the first time in months, I was not replaying arguments in my head. I was not preparing explanations. I was not trying to earn acceptance. Back at the house, Daniel and Margaret were finally confronting truths they had avoided for years. And for the first time in my life, I realized that their journey toward understanding no longer determined my own path forward. 3 months later, Daniel finally asked to meet in person. By then, winter had given way to early spring. The trees outside my apartment were beginning to bloom, and the life I had built for myself felt steady and real. I thought carefully before agreeing, not because I was afraid of seeing him, because I wanted to be certain that I was meeting him for closure rather than hope. We arranged to meet at a small public park near the river. The afternoon was bright and cool. Families walked along the trails while children played nearby. When I arrived, Daniel was already there sitting on a bench overlooking the water. The moment he stood up, I noticed how different he looked. Not older, just more aware. We exchanged a quiet greeting before sitting down. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel began talking. He told me about the months since I left. He spoke about the empty house, the silence, the conversations he finally had with his mother, the difficult truths he had spent years avoiding. For the first time since I had known him, he took full responsibility for his choices without offering excuses. He admitted that changing the locks should never have happened. He admitted that his silence had hurt me more than any argument ever could. Most importantly, he admitted that he had expected me to keep accepting things that he would never have accepted himself. Listening to him, I felt no anger. The bitterness I once carried had faded long ago. In its place was something much calmer. Understanding. Eventually, Daniel looked directly at me and asked the question I had known was coming. Is there any chance we can start over? His voice was sincere. His regret was real. Months earlier, hearing those words might have changed everything. But life had moved forward. More importantly, I had moved forward. I looked out across the river where sunlight reflected off the water and thought about the woman who had stood outside her own front door unable to get inside. That woman had spent years waiting for permission to feel valued. She no longer existed. I turned back toward Daniel and smiled gently. I truly hope you find happiness, I said. But I cannot go back. For a moment, disappointment crossed his face. Then he nodded slowly. There was sadness in his expression, but there was also acceptance. Perhaps for the first time, he understood that consequences do not disappear simply because someone finally recognizes them. Before we parted, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note thanking me for the years we shared and apologizing for the pain he caused. I folded it carefully and placed it in my bag, not because I needed it, but because it represented growth. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Margaret. It was shorter than I expected. She apologized for her actions and admitted she had confused control with concern for far too long. Reading her words, I felt a sense of peace. Not because everyone had finally agreed with me, because their understanding was no longer necessary for my healing. As spring continued unfolding outside my apartment windows, I realized something important. The story had never been about a lock or a house. It had been about belonging. For years, I searched for belonging in places where it depended on someone else's approval. The day I walked away, I finally discovered that true belonging begins with respecting yourself. And once I learned that lesson, no one could ever lock me out of my own life again.